Grigory Sokolov is far too big to fit into a single YouTube video, so today I'll just offer a couple of observations about his style, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I hope that it will be useful for your own musical growth. Let's take a look at his interpretation of Mozart. It's truly unique. What makes this interpretation so special is that it goes far beyond the traditional concern of how to play Mozart correctly without pissing off some distinguished professor. And yet, it still convinces. So how does he manage to break the rules without slipping into bad taste? Here's one conceptual trick, or principle rather, that he uses. When playing 16th notes, he makes them deliberately crisp, pearly, and even, so no one can accuse him of romanticizing those passages. His 16th notes often sound almost formal, even objective. This is crucial, because one of the easiest ways to get criticized when playing Mozart is to fall into what I call the Mendelssohnification of Mozart's figurations, when your passages sound with an overlapping legato and with some rubato. Like if you play like that, you're out from the first round of any serious competition. So most of the time, his 16th notes are played with a great margin of safety from what can be considered a bad taste. But as soon as he encounters eighth or quarter notes, whenever there's a melody, he plays with exaggerated expression, with the kind of emotional expression and freedom you'd expect from a singer or maybe even opera diva, and yet keeping the accompaniment very steady. This creates a bold, highly personal, yet logical and convincing interpretation. To get closer to Sokolov's level of mastery, one needs two things. First, a refined school of articulation, or the skill of playing very clearly. And you may ask how one gets it. Well, the best way is to study with a very demanding and very tough teacher who will torture you over just a couple of phrases or one page of music for the whole lesson. And the second skill, which is a little bit overlapping with the first, but it's not exactly the same, is the skill of what we call интонирование in my language, a concept common in Eastern Europe, and for which I don't have a precise word in English, but it basically means to actively experience and express the tension between notes, connecting them musically. In simplified terms, интонирование means playing with attitude and intention at every moment. For example, let's look at this fragment. Many people think in 2-bar phrases here, because some outdated editions included slurs Mozart never actually wrote. So one phrase and the second phrase, and this results in a kind of like bland and kind of mediocre melody. But what Sokolov does here is, first, he feels the tension between the notes the way a singer does. So ascending intervals, especially when we skip a step, are never easy. They carry emotional weight. Like, just compare with how it would sound if we would have a melody like this. Melody doesn't really have much tension because we just move around in steps. But when we skip a step, there is much more tension, much more emotional weight. Then he senses the intensity of a leap downwards. All the way to E. Imagine climbing 2 steep steps only to suddenly drop lower than where you started. That's tension. He also applies a sophisticated articulation type described brilliantly by Isaiah Braudo. He wrote a brilliant book on articulation, which unfortunately only exists in Russian as far as I know. So, but if you read Russian, please get this book. It's accessible online. Rubato об артикуляции. Because there, Rubato describes something very, very necessary, especially for classical and especially for Baroque style, for Bach pieces. It's called paradoxical disconnection, where motifs are physically separated, yet because the music still moves forward, the phrase doesn't break apart. So, for example, I disconnected them physically, but because I let the phrase further, it doesn't sound disconnected. We hear it as one coherent idea, but it contains inner struggle, inner disconnection, which makes the interpretation so much more engaging and meaningful. Sokolov is always telling a story, one that's easy to follow. He doesn't just notice details in the score, he assigns specific meanings, emotions, or ideas to them, and then reveals them clearly, often through exaggeration. In a competition-conformist world where most pianists are afraid of extremes, any form of boldness is actually refreshing. But here's the key difference between Sokolov and, let's say, Horowitz. Horowitz also exaggerated and achieved immense popularity, but in my view, in my personal opinion, his focus was more on the wow effect. He wanted to amaze, often resulting in eccentric interpretations, eccentric choices for the sake of eccentricity. Sokolov, on the other hand, seeks a deep emotional effect. With him, even something as mundane as shopping or laundry can turn into an existential quest, a miniature Greek tragedy. Another topic I want to touch on, and this is where personally I sometimes find it a little bit difficult to listen to Sokolov in some specific pieces, is rubato. It's important to know that there are two general types of rubato. The so-called German school rubato, where you arrive on the first beat, then take time. So when you have a melody, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Then you reach the first beat more or less in tempo, but then after the first beat, you take some time. And the Russian school rubato, where you take time before landing to the first beat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Like kind of delaying the resolution, delaying the first beat. Sokolov is absolutely in love with the Russian type. I don't know any other pianist so devoted to it. And that's part of what makes him unique. A Russian rubato explores dramatic energy. You don't simply land on a strong beat. You have to deserve it. In Eastern Europe, we are experts on suffering, and you can't just get what you want. If you see a cup of coffee on the table, you can't just come and take it, yeah? Each small resolution must be earned through suffering, and the more you suffer, the better person you become. And it aligns perfectly with Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tchaikovsky, and all the other masters of transcending through suffering. The problem is with this type of rubato is that when you delay the strong beat too often, or if you do it clumsily, it risks sounding disjointed. It may feel like an irritating delay before coming to the first beat, when is often also the last note is also the last note of the phrase. That's why many teachers ban this type of rubato entirely. It's just easier to avoid it altogether than to teach the difficult art of paradoxical disconnection, which keeps the musical flow intact despite separation. So if you want to get a taste of this lost art and understand it, listen to Sokolov's interpretation of romantic music specifically, because in the classical repertoire, he of course usually refrains from this. For example, this Schubert's Impromptu is a great example. Listen how Sokolov takes time between the bars, letting each phrase breathe and blossom, although most musicians would try to maintain a constant flow here. Or for example this, more subtle but incredibly beautiful moment. Here, Sokolov delays the first beat slightly and with a wide gesture. communicating that there is more tension, more excitement. But then, if you have noticed another very fine detail, just before the next strong beat, he takes a tiny bit of time, so he doesn't rush into the last note like this, directly in a straight line. He takes a little bit of time on B here, so these notes are a little bit longer, they have more distance than the other notes before them. And this is a very fine nuance which shows the mastery of the pianist, because most of pianists lose control and swallow the last couple of notes in the passage. That's why usually I recommend to my students, whenever you have a scale passage, think very well about the last 3 notes, concentrate on the last 3 notes. So the last 3 notes has to be more precise, with, if the passage goes up, with also some crescendo and kind of slower. So then you have a really good articulation in your passages. That said, especially in recent years, in some pieces, like Rachmaninoff preludes, this rubato obsession can go too far for my personal taste. For example, in his performance of the Rachmaninoff's prelude in C minor, he plays with a beautiful, poetic slowness, much slower than average, which I love actually, it's refreshing. But when, in addition to a slow tempo, he delays nearly every second downbeat, like waiting between the bars, frequently, the piece starts to fall apart, making it hard to feel its continuity. But of course, this is highly subjective. I'm sure that many of you will say that this is the best interpretation of this piece ever, and I respect your opinion. Even my wife and I don't always agree on where the limit lies and what rubato is the best for this particular spot, and yet we have a great marriage, you know. So opinions are not as important as an ability to accept that a different perspective has the right to exist. So the main takeaway here, to become a great artist, one first needs to learn the rules and obtain a great school, how to play correctly by the book. And that's what Sokolov did when he was a teenager, winning a Tchaikovsky competition while being 16 years old. You can definitely see how much potential he had and how capable he was already at this young age. But nevertheless, you could see that he was playing in a more correct way, like the way he was taught. And later on, he has discovered something truly unique. So then you need to break those rules, disobey tradition maybe, slightly, challenge norms, but do so with a clear logic. Why do you do what you do? What purpose does it serve?